The getStaticProps function can be added to any page file, and only there, as I mentioned, and you need to export it. And when you do so, then Next.js will also call this getStaticProps function on your behalf when it pre-generates a page. And this function also signals to Next.js that this is a page that should be pre-generated. Now, I just said that Next.js would pre-render any page by default, and that's true, but we'll later learn about a way of telling Next.js to not pre-render a page, and therefore it's important to understand that getStaticProps will not tell Next.js to not pre-render, but instead it kind of confirms to Next.js that this page still should be pre-generated. But in addition to just running through the component and returning the JSX code, Next.js will then also call this getStaticProps function if it finds one in your component file. So therefore here, let's say we want to load this product data dynamically, but not in the way we would do it in a standard React app with useEffect, what I showed you before. And therefore attached you find another file, the dummy backend JSON file, which is this example dummy file I used in the React example a second ago. And you should add that in your main project folder. Not in public, not in pages, just in your folder like this. Or actually maybe add a data folder. Whoops, a folder, not a file. Add a data folder and move that file into there. So that you have a data folder, and in that data folder, you have the dummy backend JSON file. And now we want to load data from that file for this index.js file, but we don't want to load it through a HTTP request that's only sent from the client side after the page was loaded. Instead, we want to pre-fetch the data before we create this component and before this component page gets pre-rendered by Next.js. And that's exactly why we then add this function which we export, the async function called getStaticProps. And again, it needs to be called exactly like this. Now in this function, you then always need to return an object. An object that has a props key. Because the function is named getStaticProps. And actually what this function does is it prepares the props for your component, so this props object. It prepares that because Next.js, if you have a getStaticProps function in your file, will first execute this function, and then in a second step, execute the component function. Now, in a second step, because that first step prepares the props for this component function. And therefore, in this getStaticProps function, you can run any code you want. Again, code that will never be visible on the client side, that fetches data and exposes data through props to this homepage component. So here I could set props equal to an object, so that the props I get here are still an object, where I have my products, and that could be an array where I, for example, have one object in that array with an ID of P1 and a title of product 1. Something like this. So now getStaticProps returns an object with a props key. That's always required. You always must return an object with a props key. And then the data in the props key is up to you, but it should be an object. And here it's an object with a products key, which holds an array of product objects. And now we'll receive that here on props on this homepage because Next.js first calls this getStaticProps function and then executes this component function. And it does both things in advance. So none of that code here runs on the client side. Instead, that all happens during build time or in development as part of this development server which we're using. So here on the homepage component, we can then expect that we do get a products key on our props. So I can use object destructuring to pull products out of props. And I use products here because that's the key I used down there. And then we can render this list dynamically by accessing products and mapping that such that every product is mapped into a list item where the key is the product ID. So this ID we got down there. And as a value between the opening and closing list item tags, I output the title like this. And with this in place, if we now visit our Next.js application, we see product 1 here. Now, of course, we're currently not fetching that data from any file. I have it hard-coded in there, but we already implemented getStaticProps with that. And if we now again view the page source of this page, we see that this data, this product 1 data, is part of the page that was sent to the client. So fetching that product data did not happen on the client, it happened on the server. And if we would dive into the Sources tab of the DevTools and look through the JavaScript code files, you wouldn't find that code anywhere in those files, because it's not part of the code that's shipped to the client side. And that means that the code in getStaticProps can do server-side things because it's not executed on the client side. So you can use credentials which your users shouldn't see, and you can also run code that wouldn't work in the browser. Code that accesses the file system, for example. And that's exactly what we're going to do next.